General Yamada, Port of Tacoma Commissioner McCarthy, Port of Seattle Commissioner Calkins, other elected officials and guests. Welcome to our first ever joint Japan-American Society Washington China Relations Council, Washington State China Relations Council, and World Trade Center Tacoma joint event down here in the South Sound. Woohoo! To be honest, there was an event similar to this up in the north, and it was so successful that the Japan-American Society and the China Relations Council agreed to do it down here in the South Sound, and we're very appreciative of that. My name is Michael Fowler, and I'm with the World Trade Center Tacoma. And I say that the event up in the north a year ago was similar because you might say we've, true to the title of this event, you might say that the U.S., China, Japan trade landscape has gone through a bit of a change. And today we have, right here up in front, we have people who have been dealing with it firsthand on the ground, our local companies and our officials. And you can bet that things will change again. We want to hear how they've dealt with it so far, what they expect the changes will be, and how they're going to deal with it in the future. First, let me tell you how this program will start. We will have Japan-American Society Dale Watanabe introduce the Consulate General, and then Man Wang of the China Relations Council will introduce the commissioners, and then Andrew Crowder of the Washington State Department of Commerce will be our moderator, introduce the panelists, and at that point we will have to take questions and answers. And then last but not least, we will have Karin Zog-Black, who is the chair of the Japan-American Society and also works at the Port of Seattle, and has also been instrumental in organizing this event. She will close the event, and there will be refreshments in the back. In terms of housekeeping, we have restrooms. If you walk toward the entrance, the last hall on the right, there's restrooms. Also, this event will be recorded. If you don't want to show up in photos or film, let somebody from the Japan-American Society know. We will blur your face. And lastly, I'd like to thank the Port of Tacoma, who is our first-tier sponsor at the World Trade Center, but also allowing us to use the facilities here. And Larry Fidera, who also has been very instrumental in setting this all up. With that, I'd like to introduce Dale Watanabe, the Executive Director of the Japan-American Society.
My pleasure to be down here. As Mike said, we did a similar event last year at this time, and it's great to see some familiar faces back. My duty this afternoon is to introduce our Consul General of Japan in Seattle, who has been here since, actually he was appointed in April of 2017, and arrived, I think, in June. But in the short space of time, he's been one of the most influential Consul Generals of Japan in the Seattle area, and we're privileged to have him here. His background is in your program. What you may not have in your program is that he's a good golfer. He has a great family with a, is he 10 now, a 9-year-old son? So total family man and a tremendous supporter of the community. Yoichiro Yamada, Consul General of Japan in Seattle.
failed to mention was that we have a fourth family member, which is a parrot, and who we, all of us, regard as the wisest and emotionally most stable of our family. But it's a great privilege to be invited to make opening remarks to this event that focuses on Japan, the United States, and China. Japan, China, and the United States are number 3, number 2, number 1 countries in the world in terms of GDP. And the combined GDP of the 3 countries amount to 47%. Therefore, the economic relationship that the 3 countries have will have an enormous impact on the world economy and the world politics. As for Japan, our largest trading partner used to be the United States. It was like that until 2006. And then China replaced Japan's, United States as Japan's #1 trade partner. Today, China accounts for 22% of Japan's trade volume in both directions. And the United States accounts for about 15+%. But this is just trade. What about investment? The cumulative direct investment from Japan to China stands at 120 billion US dollars, which might sound like a very big figure, but our cumulative direct investment to the United States stands 4 times bigger at 490 billion US dollars. And whether it is trade or investment, both the United States and China are very, very important partners for Japan. Many of you remember that in the early 1990s, we had really serious trade friction between the United States and Japan. In those days, Japan accounted for more than 50% of the United States bilateral trade imbalances. Today, the figure, in dollar terms, the trade imbalance remains about the same. There's not much difference over the past 20-something years. But today, Japan's bilateral trade imbalance with the United States, it accounts for about 9% of all the U.S. bilateral trade imbalances. What has replaced Japan as the biggest source of bilateral trade imbalance for the United States? It's of course China. China today accounts for about 45%, 44% of all the trade imbalances that the United States has on a bilateral basis. In the early 1990s, you would remember that there were, proposals and bills after bills, to sanction Japan for the alleged, trade and economic injustices and restrictive measures, etc. And now, largely, China has replaced place as the #1 target for a U.S. administration's trade anxiety. As for Japan, over the past 25 years or so, there has been a lot of direct investment into the United States. And today, overall, throughout the United States, there are about 800,000 people directly employed by Japanese companies that established their offices and factories in the United States. The other day, I heard somebody mentioning that those direct Japanese companies' direct investment creates wealth. It creates incomes, flow terms that amounts to about the same GDP as Poland, which is not a small economy. And I have no ways to verify that figure, but there must be some grounds for that person to be mentioning that figure. So if you want to check, please check and tell me if it was true. China, the U.S. trade friction is the attention of the day, is attention of the world. China, U.S. trade and economic conflict seems to be really different from the very acute and acrimonious dispute that Japan and the United States had some 25 years ago. Japan-U.S. trade frictions in those days was a dispute about figures, how many cars were imported and how many jobs were lost to Japanese competition, what was the trade and current account deficit and the surplus. So it was a dispute about figures in the established order. China-U.S. dispute seems to be about what international order to create for the future. It's not a dispute in the established world order, but what order to create and who would be the center of such international order. Well, is that my opinion? Probably yes, but I think that everybody seems to be arguing that. And I think the two key words stand out here. One is Belt and Road Initiative, and another is technological supremacy or rivalry for the technological supremacy. Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, is about international economic order. And in my short remark, I'm not going to delve into what BRI is, because everybody knows about it. But there has been a lot of anxieties expressed about the sustainability of debt and about economic benefit for the local economy in terms of training and training of local people and the transfer of technology from Chinese companies to local companies. Is it just the Chinese companies that are benefiting from these economic cooperation, or are the local companies in the developing world really benefiting from it? And the recent tweet, whether Italy will become a full-fledged part of the BRI or not, has been a very big bone of contention between China on the one hand and the European Union on the other. So, the U.S. response to BRI, it was not a response. The U.S. took the, I think, initiative in the first, but the U.S. proposal was actually TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, commenced under President Obama, and it was obviously a very, very good, initiative, and it could set up rules for electronic transactions, the state-run companies, and intellectual property, and all sorts of aspects that would be required for the trade and investment in the and so on in the 21st century. But unfortunately, from a Japanese perspective, President Trump on the first day, rejected that agreement. But this rivalry between TPP on the one hand, and I hope that the United States will one day, change its mind and come back to join TPP 11 in the future. So rivalry between the TPP on the one hand and the Belt and Road Initiative is about which of the two countries, United States and China, will take the leadership in forming the world economic order in the next decades. Second key word is technology. And technology, of course, in the days of the Japan-United States rivalry, it was about the technology, which whether Toyota or the General Motors had, better technology, etc. But today, the technology that is a hot issue is completely different. In what respect? In the respect that it is about the power structure. Today, the computing and data processing power of the artificial intelligence is so fiercely strong that anybody who develops and controls artificial intelligence is capable of affecting the world military order and the world power structure. In many repressive countries, the surveillance system of the society are being augmented with the help of the AI. And what people are talking about is this technology being used for the supremacy in forming the next civilization. So whether we would like to pursue a free country, a free world order, or a surveillance country, that is the issue. Therefore, it's much more deeper than the question over intellectual property rights or economic damages incurred by the infringement of intellectual property. So finally, where does Japan stand? It's very simple. Japan relies on probably half or more of all its food it consumes from imports. It relies on import for all the oil and natural resources that it uses. And the supply chain has globalized so to such an extent that we really need to have a stable and predictable and rules-based world trade and investment order. We want a good and stable multilateral international order. That's the conclusion. And what does that mean? In the long term, we want what I would like to say off-tar, open, free, transparent, accountable, and rules-based off-tar. Sorry, this is my word, you don't need to remember that. My way of remembering it. Open, free, transparent, accountable, and rules-based system. And for this, the United States is the best part, has always been, and is likely to remain our best partner. As for China, we still, China is struggling. China is making efforts, and we appreciate that. We want China to be more open, and we want China to be more engaged, but we still seem to, witness what I would like to call Macam. M-A-C-A-M, that's my way of remembering that. That's murky, aggressive, coercive, arbitrary, and manipulative. You can forget about that. So, to conclude, we want, from the viewpoint of Japan, we want the United States, strong United States leadership in both political and economic order. And we want the United States to, be a leader of multilateralism multilateral order. And we want the United States to stay away from unilateralism or bilateralism. U.S. is such a powerful country that if you engage in a bilateral negotiation, it always has its way, but that's not the way to maintain its leadership in the rules-based society. So Japan will always support the United States in achieving these aims because it's in the best national interest of Japan. And we want to maintain an open and free Indo-Pacific area. And we want to maintain a free and open international economic and political order. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's program. My name is Melin, and I'm with Washington State China Relations Council. The council was founded in 1979 to foster stronger commercial, educational, and cultural ties between Washington State and China. So we're excited today to co-host this event with Japan American Society, Washington Trade Center in Tacoma, in partnership with Port of Tacoma, Port of Seattle, and Northwest Seaport Alliance. So I'm not going to talk about how important trade is to our region because that's why we're having this event today. But I do want to say that trade is an economic driver for our region, not only because not only the forms of exports of Washington State goods and services, but also the extensive system of services related to cargo handling, such as longshoremen, trucking, rail, transloading, and warehousing. And the ports are among our state's most critical economic development assessments, handling millions of TEUs in containerized cargo, either to or from overseas markets, including China and Japan. So I'm excited to announce the participation today of two of our local leaders, Port of Tacoma Commissioner John McCarthy, and Port of Seattle Commissioner Calkins. Both have extensive experience working in international trade-related issues and have a wealth of knowledge that they'll share with us today. So their bios are in your program, but still I'm going to just talk about who they are, what they do. So Commissioner McCarthy, so prior to his recent election to the Port of Tacoma Commission, served as Pierce County District and Superior Court judge for more than 22 years, from which he recently retired. I can say he's been engaging closely with organizations and activities that promote Washington State maritime industry for his whole career life, including a honorary life member of the Washington Public Ports Association. He also worked as a longshoreman for 10 years and served previously on the Port of Tacoma Commission. He also serves on the Pierce County Regional Council and as Port of Tacoma's tribal liaison. So Commissioner Calkins was elected to the Port of Seattle Commission in 2017. So he actually has extensive experience working with or at nonprofit organizations, including his current work at Ventures, a charitable organization that supports low-income entrepreneurs in the Puget Sound region to start and expand their businesses. He also worked in Central and South America in the late 1990s and early 2000s for disaster relief and human rights nonprofit works. So the China Relations Council is also honored to have Commissioner Calkins as a valued board member. So thank you, Commissioner, for your great support. At the Port of Seattle, Commissioner Calkins focuses his work on sustainable economic development. Now please join me in welcoming Commissioner McCarthy and Calkins.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. I appreciate that. And also, I appreciate Consul General's comments. Thank you for those as well. I'm really happy to be here this afternoon with Commissioner Calkins to welcome you in Tacoma for what I'm sure will be an interesting and hopefully lively discussion about U.S., Japan, China trade relations. I am glad that Commissioner Calkins and I are both here together and addressing you together, because international trade is obviously not only a national issue, but it's a very important regional issue for this area. A strong and vibrant trade relationship with China, Japan, and the world is critical for continued growth of our ports and the economies of the Puget Sound as well as the Pacific Northwest. The total trade through our Northwest Seaport Alliance seaports of the ports of Tacoma and Seattle last year was valued at over $77 billion. And indeed, we did handle the equivalent of 2.4 million TEUs, 20 equivalent unit containers. Of those 2.4 million, nearly 1.4 million resulted from two-way trade with China and Japan, which represented over 70% of our containerized imports and nearly 38% of our exports. We also handled a variety of non-containerized commodities like agricultural and industrial equipment and automobiles. Despite some of today's challenges, and we read about them every day, every morning I'm reading about tariffs and other things, and so certainly in the news, and we'll probably hear about some of those issues from some of our customers and beneficial cargo owners here this afternoon. Despite that, the prospects for international trade are good. At the Northwest Seaport Alliance, the ports of Seattle and Tacoma are working together to ensure that we have the shipping lines, the connections, and the infrastructure to support our customers in future growth that will come from trade with Asia as well as the rest of the world. We continue to build on the strong and long-lasting relationships with all of our international shipping line customers. Our gateway was the first to welcome container ships from China when COSCO called at Seattle in 1979, and the 40th year anniversary will occur on April 18th of this year. So today we are proud to count Chinese carriers COSCO Shipping as well as OOCL, as well as Japan's Ocean Network Express and Westwood shipping lines, among the shipping lines that call it our harbors. And both Ryan Calkins and I met together with leaders from COSCO, OOCL, and the Japanese carriers in October in Asia. We're working with all of our ocean carriers to expand their business here in the Pacific Northwest. Washington companies have access to 18 international carriers which offer direct services to more than 60 ports of call throughout the world. And we are now making strategic investments in our marine terminals to ensure that we have the capacity and the big ship handling capability to grow our volumes from international trade into the future. You may have heard, particularly last week, about four new Super Post Panamax cranes that arrived at Husky Terminal here in Tacoma. If you haven't seen them, you should. They are some of the largest cranes on the U.S. West Coast. Last week we were fortunate to have a above-the-fold picture in the New York Times of the four cranes arriving at the Port of Tacoma, which kind of was a stroke of good marketing skill by, I think, the port staff. So we're also very close, perhaps this month, to an agreement to the modernization of Terminal 5 in Seattle to likewise make it big ship ready. The Northwest Seaport Alliance Marine Cargo operations supported more than 58,000 jobs across the state's economy and generate $5.9 billion in revenue for Washington businesses in 2017. A significant part of that came directly from trade with Japan and China. Our ports also importantly support living wage jobs for the region. And we just completed a market study, and we were surprised to learn that the average wage of those jobs that we created is now $95,000 a year. As a region, we need to be aware and actively engage on international trade policy, as well as the geopolitics that influence our relations and the opportunities we have for trade with these countries. Many thanks to the World Trade Center Tacoma, the Washington State China Relations Council, and the Japan-American Society for their work to organize this program here today. Forums like this are needed to further the dialogue and call attention to the importance of free and fair trade. At this time, I'd like to turn over for further comment to Commissioner Calkins.
Good afternoon. So we put together a bunch of remarks for this, and I think I'm going to kind of wing it a little bit because there's a few things I want to talk about. I also was really impressed with what the Consul had to say, and I may want to. I see Karen; she's panicking in the back because she helped me put these together. But I want to keep creating new words today. So we got two words. We got Oftar and Macam, and I wrote those down. I'm going to use them myself. I might rearrange them a little bit for emphasis, but I want to add another word, which maybe you can help me come up with a word, but it's this idea that the global nexus or locus of trade has shifted from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And it's slowed down a bit recently because of our own president's actions, but we think it's going to pick back up, hopefully in 2 years. So that word, I was thinking, boy, it's something like Atlantic, but with Pacific, and Pacific's already taken, and pacifist is already taken. Pacifician doesn't really have a ring, but the idea is the economic, political, and cultural center of gravity will be the Pacific. And for those of us on the panel and around the room today, that is very good news. For me as a Port of Seattle Commissioner, thinking about what the next century will look like in terms of global trade, I think we need to prepare ourselves for more traffic, for more population, for more engagement with the Pacific Rim countries, and understand that as the impacts of climate change hit, that's only going to accelerate the process for the Pacific Northwest. We will be a climate refuge. And as we talked today, Commissioner McCarthy shared about the seaport aspect of what we do. At the Port of Seattle, we run both the seaport and the airport. Seattle-Tacoma International is now the 8th busiest in the United States. And a big part of that is air cargo. And when you think air cargo, you might think those windowless planes you see, 747s taking off. About 50% of our air cargo right now is in the belly of the holds of the passenger planes. So it's a very lucrative part of what we do. And we now have 28 weekly flights as of this April between Seattle and Japan, and 44 weekly flights between Seattle and China. We hope that will grow. We announced a flight to Singapore as well, and we're looking constantly to expand those connections with the Pacific Rim. That for me is really exciting news because along with being a pacifist or whatever that word is going to be, I'm also a cosmopolitan. I genuinely believe that the more connected we are, the more off-tar we are in not just our economics, but our inner relationship, the better we do. That I'm I guess, an old school macroeconomist in that I believe that the free interchange of goods and ideas and, really key here, people results in a rising tide that lifts all boats, to borrow a marine metaphor. And so I hope that forums like today's engender that kind of sense, that we're all in this together, that boundaries are artificial, that borders are artificial, that we should be doing what we can to supersede those, that they should not be murky and aggressive and arbitrary, but that they should be open and free, and that kind of interchange of commerce and ideas and people is good for all of us. So I won't belabor too much that point. I do want to emphasize how important for us the relationships with China and Japan have been. We had a very astute leader in Warren G. Magnuson who understood that a relationship with China would be an asset and not a liability, and forged ahead at a time when our political relationship was toxic. Even before Nixon and his famous ping-pong diplomacy, Magnuson was saying, how do we make Washington and China a solid relationship? And as a result, we saw the first container ship to ever call on U.S. soil was at the Port of Seattle. And we look forward to celebrating that later this year. And that relationship remains strong. And with Japan, I can personally attest to the fact that when I was a child here in Edmonds, Washington, that the efforts of the Japanese government to engender good relationships between our countries meant that I was taking a class in 3rd grade learning very basic Japanese, and then got to participate in junior high in an interchange of students between Japan and the United States. And so I've always felt a kinship to Japan. I hope that kind of stuff continues, and I hope that we continue to foster that type of economic development. Commissioner McCarthy and I are part of a group of 10 commissioners who are committed to this notion of trade facilitation. We're keenly interested in export promotion, but we also understand that imports are vital to this region as well. In my bio, you'll see that for 10 years I led an import and distribution company, and we purchased about 40% of our inbound goods from Asia Pacific. And so I know firsthand what it means to have access to a viable port infrastructure right here. Our business would not have existed in the Georgetown neighborhood of Seattle had it not been for the Port of Seattle being right there. And we were responsible for dozens of jobs as a result of that, well-paying, good family wage jobs. So it's that kind of work that John and I are engaged in and that we hope to continue. And we're thankful for all of you to be here, and I look forward to a great discussion today.
So good afternoon, everybody. How's the mic level? I'm Andrew Crowder from the State of Washington Department of Commerce. I think we're ready to move from the large picture to the more specific and tactical picture. The Washington State Department of Commerce is the lead economic development agency, we think, in the state of Washington. Our agency mission is to strengthen communities. We do that by, I think, growing and improving jobs primarily. One part of that is encouraging Washington exports to the rest of the world. So that is our orientation to this topic, and that's why we're here today. So we certainly appreciate being invited by the Japan-American Society and by the ports to be part of the events today. It's my job to sort of introduce the speakers, get the discussion going here, and before I do that, I want to hit the general topics again. In Japan and China, as the Consul General said, we have the 3 largest economies in the world, with 3 of the 4 largest bilateral trade flows in the world between them. And each country is also facing substantial economic pressure domestically. There are different pressures, and they're responding to it in different ways. But what that means is that trade relations and trade policy disputes are even sort of more fraught than they might have been in the past, because again, each country is dealing with different economic pressures. The stance of the current administration is that trade deficits mean that the U.S. is somehow losing, that it is caught in bad trade agreements or flawed trade agreements. And its tool to address those perceived imbalances so far, the tool that it seems to be using most, is the tool of the tariff. So as different tariff policies are rolled out, or the tools that they're using that they think give them the most leverage are in these disputes are tariffs. And so as different tariffs roll out, they have different effects downstream. So we're here to learn how Washington businesses are coping with that and sort of part of what the road ahead might look like. So we have some panelists here who are actively involved in trade with China and Japan. We have Dennis Frett from Toria Composite Materials, and they do composite materials for aircraft, for I think golf clubs. There's several different applications for composite materials. I think automotive and sporting goods might be really big continuing applications for those things in addition to aerospace. They do about 50% of their business overseas, and they're doing what you said, 220 million
In export.
in export. So as he was saying, sort of the biggest company that we haven't heard of. Of course, I mean here, their business with Boeing is quite important. So next, we have John Melin from Brown and Haley, that luxury confection that we all know that's local. And the next best thing to being a Tacoma native, as Dennis is being a Saskatoon native. So thank you for that. It's and I believe that Brown and Haley went on a governor's mission to China and some years ago. And if you can talk about what that looked like, that would certainly be interesting. We have Amy Paulose with Ames International, which does nuts, chocolates, and teas. I think these are high-end goods and might be somewhat insulated from impacts of tariff, but I'm interested to hear what that might look like for you and your engagement with those. And then immediately to my right, we have Robert Hamilton. Robert is the governor's advisor for trade. I've worked with Robert for my entire time at Commerce, which is 15 plus years now. Robert is the one person in the state that I think we can all count on to have read things like the NAFTA agreement in its entirety. He reads these multiple 100-page trade agreements and also make sure that our responses to them as a state are legal. So what I think I would like to do is ask Robert to give sort of an overview of where we are right now, what the treaties are, what the tariffs are, what he's heard. The 2018 trade numbers just came out, and I think, Robert, we were crunching those for the last week or so, and maybe have an early read on that. So
I can talk about that.
Yeah, what I'd like to do is I'd like to get Robert to talk first, and then I'd like for each of our panelists, if they'd be willing to speak for about 5 minutes, introduce their companies and their histories sort of with Japan and China, and then once that general material is done, we will dive into some questions. But for now, anything for the moment that the audience needs to hear about? Okay. Robert, then would you please set the stage for us?
Sure. Here's a quick overview of how we got to all these different tariffs and the future of where we're going to look at the tariffs. So start off in February 7th of last year when the administration announced it was imposing tariffs and quotas on imports of washing machines and solar panels from all countries. This is done under Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974 after an industry petitions the United States International Trade Commission, and it does an investigation, and if it makes an affirmative determination that the increased imports are so high that they're causing either serious injury or threat of serious injury to the domestic industry, it will thwart possible recommendations to the White House. And the White House, at discretion, could accept any one of those or reject it, do nothing. In this case, the administration elected to put tariffs and quotas on imports from those products from all countries. For solar panels, they only last 4 years, for washing machines 3 years, but they can be extended 4 additional years, but no further. Second action was in June 1st last year when the administration announced 25% tariffs on steel imports from all countries and 10% tariffs on aluminum imports from all countries. This is done under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This is where the U.S. Department of Commerce Secretary does an investigation, work with other agencies to determine whether whether such imports are a threat to national security, and then the administration has its options to take action or not. This is such a rarely used statute. It was last used in 1986, having to do with machine tools. Most targets have been 28 investigations before this administration, 9 with oil. And this is what led to the embargoes on Iranian oil in 1979 and Libya in 1982. But I point that out because what was particularly unusual is that the Section 232 tariffs were imposed on imports from all countries, but there's been some minor exceptions since then. But this is kind of a break with past practice. Another thing it's important to note is these tariffs are up to the President's discretion. There's no time limit on them, so they can be indefinite. The third round of action involved Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, and this was on June 6th. The administration announced 25% tariffs on $34 billion in Chinese imports, followed August 23rd and July 6th. And August 23rd, there was an additional 25% tariffs on $16 billion worth of Chinese imports. And then September 24th, in response to China's retaliation, the administration initially imposed 25% tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese imports. That later was dropped to 10%. Still, now it's been postponed, the tariff hike up to 25%, postponed indefinitely, pending negotiations with China. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 requires the USTR to take action if there's a finding that our trading partners are violating trade agreements or discriminating against U.S. products or services, or unfairly burdening burdensome practices with regard to U.S. commerce. So this obviously led to increased prices for the imports that were on the U.S. list, and retaliation from our trading partners. There's about 14 different retaliation lists. Impact about $4.1 billion in Washington State 2017 exports. Now, in terms of future tariffs, we had this discussion knowing, as I mentioned before, that 10% tariff on $200 billion of Chinese products could be raised up to 25%, or they're negotiating now. It's possible that this could be, if there's a breakthrough, that there could be a slow phase out of those tariffs. It's not clear where that's going. You also have another EU retaliation for the aluminum and steel tariffs that's due to go into effect in 2021. You have the administration's threat to impose tariffs on another 267 billion of Chinese imports. That hasn't been in the press as much, so I don't know whether that's fading or not. And then you have national security and tariff investigations with respect to autos. That could be as much as $350 billion worth of imports. Of course, you get possibly retaliation. There's questions there because the USMCA, the NAFTA 2.0 agreement, has rules governing different rules for Mexico and Canada, and there's talk of not having Japan and the EU involved in that national security tariff while we do trade agreement negotiations with them. So it could be, even though I said 350 billion, potentially the tariffs could affect a smaller scale, and hence the retaliation could be smaller. There's also national security investigation on imports of uranium, and then this past week on titanium sponge. The import values of those are lower, so any possible retaliation would also be lower. So that's kind of the past background on tariffs and the possible future U.S. tariffs and potential retaliation going forward. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Robert. That helps give us a larger picture. In terms, a quick question for you, Robert, in terms of policy levers. If we hear of pain from Washington exporters, what is the reporting mechanism for that upward?
I can always help people navigate, where to find help if it's possible. It might be that there's, in some cases, there are exclusions. Usually those are just for 1 year and you have to redo the process. But I can help folks find resources for that. I also think people should let their elected officials know whether the tariffs are good or bad for them, either way. But let them know if they're feeling pain or if they're feeling that they help. But you have to be a squeaky wheel in order to get attention. Because you always hear from the congressional delegation, they always want to hear individual stories because those resonate.
Thank you. Dennis, I'm going to pivot to you since you're with Toray, a very technical product, sort of high value added product, and a product that goes into other products with long sales cycles, one would assume, and you sort of have to have a long planning horizon. But if you could tell us a little bit about Toray's business here in Washington and its business with Japan and China, and then that would help us.
First, let me back up and explain to you who Toray is. You said it. I think it's the largest company that most people have never heard of. In Japan, everybody knows Toray Industries. It's like a DuPont, a Dow Chemical. Started in 1926 as the Toyo Rayon Company. Currently, Toray Industries, publicly traded in Japan, is $22 billion in revenue, 47,000 employees worldwide, 250 manufacturing facilities in 26 countries. So that's Toray. My division within Toray, when you're at Boeing and Boeing knows Toray because of composites, they think, oh, Toray's composites. My division is less than 10% of Toray. My Toray Composite Materials America is only about 30% of my division. So even though I have 1,000 employees in the United States, 650 in Tacoma, we're approaching 700 million, we're less than 3% of Toray. So globally. So as far as trade and Japan, Toray Composite Materials America started in 1992, and that was Japan investing in 25 acres in Frederickson. I've been with the company for 24 years, and I've seen a lot, including over $1 billion of investment by Toray Japan in just my factories in South Carolina, Alabama, and Tacoma. Originally in Tacoma, 100% of the carbon fiber material we utilized came from Japan. So you'd import all the fiber from Japan, we'd impregnate it with epoxy resin and sell it to golf shaft manufacturers from Bangladesh to Korea to Taiwan to Japan and in the US. We were very big in fishing rod golf club shafts way back when. Now, instead of that 80-20, it's the other way around. We're 80% aerospace. And that is mainly with 787 and the 777X using composites. So as far as impact to our business, from a Toray perspective, it's huge. And Toray does a monthly call as far as what are the tariffs impacting. And believe it or not, it's impacting globally because if you think regionally here, our state had big impacts over the summer on cherries and apples, right? Because of harvest time, right? But what did that do to other countries that harvest them? Well, all of a sudden the demand was higher in their capacity, and so your market's talking about murky, right? Talking about unpredictable. So we see the same thing in raw materials. Specifically, Toray buys a lot of nylon 6,6 ABS resins, acrylonitrile, those types of base polymers that go into everything from carpet fibers to airbags to even carbon fiber. But when there's retaliatory tariffs, and then all of a sudden big markets in China are not buying American products, but they're buying Japanese and other Southeast Asian, all of a sudden you see a 20% swing in a commodity pricing. which happened to us. And so our third quarter, which was October, November, December, we had about a $2 million hit in raw material pricing.
Airlines tend to do forward fuel contracts. Can you do any of that?
We do, but we have contracts that are based on indexes. Okay, so if you have an index, which is polypropylene, or an index on, and that market is affected by this global tit for tat thing, then we see impacts. Even though we have a long-term contract which is based on indexes, when those indexes swing, then it impacts us. And then other things, of course, we do import about, as you said, we export over $220 million worth of material out of the Port of Tacoma. We import, we prefer to import via ocean or export via ocean. All of our finished product has to be frozen. People don't realize that from Tacoma. So if we're sending product to all around the world in the underbelly of an airliner, then it's with dry ice and things, which we try to avoid, but we do. The 220 million we export goes to about 30 countries. Over 50 million of that is Japan. So Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Fuji Heavy Industries in Japan. We do sell about 5 million into China. Believe it or not, half of that's aerospace. The other half is the sports and recreation. Believe it or not, a lot of hockey sticks, they don't use them in Asia, but they're made there. And the materials come from here, they're made there, they come back into the US and Canada. But we import about $150 million of raw materials, and about half of that's from Japan, which also comes through the Port of Tacoma and Port of Seattle.
Right, thank you for that. It's very specific. I'd like to move on to Brown and Haley. You know, this is the confection we all know and love, and I can't imagine people giving it up no matter what the price is.
Yeah, we're not happy with the current state. So everyone knows almond roca. If this is sea salt caramel roca. If you've not had it, you should try it. There's some open. Dennis and I are just going to open it up right here. Brown and Haley is a Tacoma business formed in 1912. Feel free to Amy, I know you've been eating your confections all day. In 1923, Harry Brown created almond roca. In 1927, put it in a coffee tin and flushed it with carbon dioxide and extended the shelf life.
You did that in 23?
1927.
27?
Yeah. It was the demand. So if you cut the skin on an almond, it has a 3 to 6 month shelf life. And people wanted the product. They tasted it. Their friends might have taken it on the train up to Chicago or down to San Francisco. And so it got put in the tin can, flushed with carbon dioxide, and that extended the shelf life. Export started in 1929. In the Shanghai City Museum, there's a tin of almond roca that dates back to the 30s in a diorama. The product went with the troops during World War II throughout Asia. Bugs can't get through a tin, so it survived. That really helped our company and our brand and our community. Our first official exports to Japan were 1959. Japan is our 5th largest market in the world and has been a very consistent market for us since 1959. In the late 60s, in Hong Kong, the import manager for a grocery chain came up with the idea of selling almond roca as a Chinese New Year gift, and took roca and transliterated that into the Chinese characters into roca, meaning happy family, and those were the Chinese characters in the branding and the trademark registration, along with the English trademark registration over there. Television advertising, little bits of product crossing into China. By the late 70s, our product was going into China, and in 1988, we had the first formal sales into China through the friendship stores in Beijing and in Guangzhou, government officials and foreigners, essentially. And the market has grown from there. Now, Hong Kong and China represent our 2nd and 3rd largest markets. Greater China represents over 20% of our roca sales. This is a lot of our jobs that depend on roca sales. It's actually a very complex strategy because, well, the Chinese are entrepreneurial traders. And so there are many, many ways that our product comes into China. And so we have an integrated strategy that combines offline in Hong Kong, wholesalers in Hong Kong, distributor offline in China, online in China. They have this cross-border trade e-commerce, which is actually a way individual Chinese can use to get around punitive tariffs that the Chinese government puts on items coming in. It's very complex, but it's important to us. There are three things that this growth in our trade with China has done. The first is we've learned a lot. We've learned some very new ways of thinking about marketing and developing products. And I call out e-commerce in particular. You know, we're in Puget Sound, right? This is the center of e-commerce. This is where it all happens. Except it happens at 3 times the pace in China. It's pretty crazy what's going on with e-commerce over there. We decided a few years ago to really invest our efforts in understanding, and things that we've learned over there we're bringing back and thinking about here. The second thing is that there's a lot of demand for innovation. Much like Japan, actually, among the young, there's a search for freshness and newness. If we think about the consumer society in Japan, it's a very sophisticated, very mature consumer society. The consumer society in China is not as sophisticated and mature, but it grows very rapidly. And so there's a craving for innovation and for new things. And that's pushed us. You know, those kinds of innovations actually lead us, help us, to push us to create sea salt caramel roca at a pace that we wouldn't necessarily for the United States. The third thing, though, is that through sales and profit, this growth in Greater China has given us a way to make a pretty remarkable investment in our production facility here in Tacoma, and we're undertaking this right now. We've been working at it for 2 years, and we're actually not producing roca right now because there's machinery being installed and tuned, and my boss, Mr. Clare over here, CEO Pearson Clare, those that don't know you, has led our board to decide to make this investment, which for us it's a 20-year investment to be able to expand our production and to be able to make new items. And that's all fantastic. And you sign your contracts with the Chinese retailers and with your distributors, and then the uncertainty of a trade war hits, and all of those contracts that you signed and can't get out of now lose money. Yeah. Our company is highly dependent on trade. Our family, we call them the Brown and Haley families, the 173 families that our business supports depend on trade. You ask them what the biggest selling season is, and they'll say Christmas. You go onto the floor of Brown and Haley and you ask anybody what the second biggest selling season is, and they're going to tell you Chinese New Year. And they're proud of it. And so the uncertainty of this matters immensely to us. Trade policy and trade policy certainty matters to us. We've had to deal with fakes. IP issues matter to us. Tariffs, uncertainty in tariffs matter. Business planning is challenging, and the stories, can go on and on and on, and how we choose to play as a nation versus how Canada or the EU or Australia or China plays matters a lot. And it's galling when we give up our leadership position and let everybody else write the rules, because they don't write them with our best interests at heart. So, I'm hoping that what we're enduring right now, and the experience of recent years, where frankly the outcome of our approach to trade hasn't met expectations, can be tightened up, and we see some good outcomes that will help the policies meet expectations so we can continue to grow and extend this wonderful brand and build our wonderful, small, medium-sized business. It's not quite 200 million of exports we're doing through the port. But there are a lot of containers going, and when we run into challenges, they're real challenges.
Thank you for that. One quick question.
Yes.
Move on. When you developed the new product, the salted caramel, what would your normal development cycle be, and what was it for that new product? What can you say?
We created almond roca in 1923,
Sure.
and then in 2003 we created mocha roca. We were prodded on by Starbucks, actually. We sold it in Starbucks exclusively for the first 2 years. So extension number 1 was 80 years. What I'll say is, you think, okay, Washington State Company, where do we do consumer tests? Well, we can't afford to hire big research firms that go out around the world or out around the United States. So we call it kind of mother-in-law research. It's not really mother-in-law research. We have forms and we'll do taste tests. We do taste tests in Hong Kong, in either Guangzhou or Shanghai. We prefer Shanghai because the Guangzhou tastes are very similar to their Cantonese tastes. We do them in Toronto. We do them here in Seattle. And then we normally do them in New Jersey or Florida, depending on where we have an affiliation. So that gives you an idea of the weight that we put on the Asian market for product innovation.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Amy, what can you tell us about your different business lines and how your company's evolved and how it is responding right now?
Sure. Thank you. John and I share many of the same experiences and war stories. For some background and context, Ames International is a local manufacturer here, just on the other side of the freeway, chocolates and nuts as well. And our experience with trade goes back to the foundation of the company. We started our business in 1987. It was started by my parents and my family. My father is originally from India, so inherently trade was in his blood. And we started by importing cashews into the local market here. In 1995, in an effort to expand the product line, we added chocolate into the portfolio. And at a very early stage in the history of our business, trade was very important. Our context, our community here in the Washington area was with folks from Japan. Similar to Commissioner Calkins, I grew up in the time frame in which the Japanese-American relationship was extremely strong and still is. Took Japanese. My peer sets were students from Japan, and having that exposure into those cultures and being able to export our product at an early state into the airports and into the Japanese market was an important part of our growth. In 2005, we began looking at the Chinese market, in particular because one of the issues that we saw was, to some extent, our geographical limitation in servicing the rest of the U.S. market. After the financial crisis, as we started to see fuel prices increase, a good portion of our business at that time was very much dedicated to Midwest and East Coast retailers. And what we would see is that our freight costs would go from $3,000, $4,000 a truck to very suddenly $5,000 to $7,000 a truck. And we saw that the long-term kind of scenario was not going to be one where fuel costs were going to be coming down, in addition to the fact that labor is less. And so we really started looking at where is our natural market. And for us, that became China, Japan, Southeast Asia. And so today, China is a very important part of our market, as well as we hope to reinvigorate the Japanese market as well. But there have been real challenges, real and present, clear challenges. Our business, we are hoping to have more than 50% based off of exports. When trade issues began last year, it literally stopped portions of our business to China, where it became conversations of, we want your product to, well, let's see what's going to happen. Let's wait 6-9 months. And again, as John had said, is the uncertainty, which was what really kind of made things difficult. It doesn't because there is a lack of interest in American products. There's a tremendous interest in American products. There's a tremendous interest for Chinese individuals to work with Americans as well. And so those were very frustrating times to not know what was happening and to not be able to move forward. Some of my personal concerns when it comes to the tactics and the policies that we have taken is the long-term ramifications. We, through personal conversations that I've had with our Chinese buyers, is they have said, well, you know what, let's start looking at other suppliers from other markets. So China and New Zealand, take for example, especially when it comes to food in particular, have developed very, very strong relationships. And those are going to directly impact dairy, agriculture, and the Chinese consumer, when it comes to consumer products in particular, they become accustomed to taste. Food is very much a taste. You like it, you don't like it. And you build that inherent memory for yourself and your families. And so what I see in the very near future is that American companies will start to lose those opportunities because countries like Australia, New Zealand, Europe, we do a lot of business with the Alibaba group, Tmall, and when we started our online e-commerce trade with them in 2005 and 2015 and 16, they had a very stated purpose to come here to the U.S. and to encourage small and medium-sized businesses to China. They had very big plans to promote their e-commerce businesses in the U.S. to China, and that has literally stopped. And so I think this will have long-term ramifications beyond just the short-term positioning of trade and tariffs.
That is a wonderful segue from sort of the individual discussions into sort of where we go from here. We have about 10 minutes before we open it up to the audience, and I'd like to sort of pose a few questions to the panel. First of all, if you could say, and this is to any of you, if you could say something to your electeds, what would it be? What would you say to your elected officials about a way forward in the current very complex environment?
I'll jump in. Three things: certainty, sophistication, and toughness on IP. The certainty, Amy has described it, and it's the same for us. The sooner we can get to certain rules, then we can play the game. It's hard to play a game when you don't know the rules, and you're likely to lose. The sophistication, political populism does not write good trade policy. We need to be smart when we think about trade policy. Toughness on IP. I'm glad that we're hearing more of that in the everyday discussion regarding the current trade discussions. You know, it's inevitable for those who are kind of historians of economics. It's inevitable that you end up with trade balances when you have a country which is making its money off of invisibles trade, so off of insurance and off of finance as opposed to manufacturing things cheaply, and a country that can manufacture things cheaply. But what the big dog country has is technological intellectual property, design intellectual property, brand intellectual property, and that does need to be protected. But certainty and sophistication. You know, there's a reason that these teams that work on trade policy, they're huge teams and they work in closed rooms, and you know, Robert deals with them. And Robert, I'm glad you read all these things, because I don't want to have to do it, and I know when I read the newspaper I can't get to the right answer in 30 seconds.
Would any of you like to amplify?
I think that's key, the IP. You know, we have a competitive advantage. It's Japanese technology, which is licensed here, but we've had issues with APT-10, if you've never heard of it, Advanced Persistence Threat, right? And Toray in general, its competitive advantage in many of their product lines is the technology. So it's important. Is that the cause, the end all no. So same thing, certainly for us, planning. Once again, we plan on a budget cycle, you plan on your raw materials, and you see a 20% swing within month to month because of market dynamics. Those things really hit us hard.
I'm far more excited about my children growing up and working as engineers at Torre than becoming coal miners, bluntly put. Sure.
I think it's important to realize that trade promotes global understanding, and beyond the pure just economics of dollars going back and forth, the actions that we are taking are impacting future generations and their perspective of the American culture, who we are, what we do, how we act, and that has much longer term ramifications than the short-term dollars. And so we live in a global society. We need to work as teams. The way in which workplaces today, they're about teams. So we need to stop pitting one another against each other and look at, we all live on this planet, we have to come together to find solutions.
Thank you. Robert, do you have any recommendations for private companies and how they pitch their distress?
Do it as broadly as possible. If you have a complaint, you like something, you don't like something, you got to make your elected officials know. You need to talk to the relevant agencies about that as well, whether it's USTR or whatever. If it's something, even setting up a tariff exclusion process that hasn't been set up. Well, finally they added a different one for some of the Section 301 tariffs that we put in place. But without that noise from Congress and the private sector, I don't think the administration would go forward with that. So you have to be vocal.
Okay. Have any of you have any of you thought about the effects on your business of not, participating in TPP and its successor?
I'm not there yet.
Sure.
I hear more and more from Washington companies and industries about how we're falling behind in terms of the playing field just on tariffs alone. And the case in point is, obviously, we pulled out of the TPP, but went forward with the remaining countries. They're instituting it. This is particularly important with respect to the Japanese market, and then Japan's signed a trade agreement with the EU. Well, our ag guys, when you go export to Japan, it's much higher tariffs on ag than on non-ag products. So they're potentially could lose their market at a time when they're already feeling threatened by the tariffs on China's placement of products. I know that the wheat guys, and I talked to them a while back, when the tariffs went in place by China, they were scared to death that they're going to lose that market. In fact, there were no shipments. And then the second thing was, well, CPTPP is going forward, and we're afraid to death that we're going to lose the Japanese market. So.
I think by not participating, we essentially handed writing of the rules over. Thankfully, we had Japan and Canada remaining in the group of countries, but we had a real opportunity to write the rules for how trade would happen around the Pacific Rim, and they've been written without our influence. I think something that we've experienced as a company is a little bit of a loss of face. When we get into some of the Southeast Asian countries, they feel the pressure of China. They feel the oppressiveness of Chinese government trade policies and Chinese government money. And they look to the Americans as the people who will, fly the flag for a rules-based system and a counterbalance. And when we balk at that, they're left. Obviously, there's the loss of opportunity. we had one distributor explain, this is a Thai distributor, explain how a manufacturer was manufacturing chocolates, getting them, wrapped, kind of like one of our foil wrapped rocas, and then they would ship them into bulk into China. They would add enough value in China that the product became a Chinese product from a tariff perspective. And then using the Chinese the Chinese trade agreement with Thailand would import this European chocolate into China or into Thailand. So, what they're doing is essentially transferring economic activity into China because China had created a valuable trading relationship with Thailand. And frankly, the only way that we would be able to compete in that market with that competitor would be to send our product into China, add enough value to call it Chinese American almond roca, and sell it to Thailand. We're not doing that, but that's an outcome.
Also, those agreements contain rules of imports. The TPP and the TTIP negotiations had rules that you couldn't get done at the WTO at that time, having to do with digital trade, distortions by state-owned enterprises. If you can't get it done in the WTO, if you do it at the TPP and the TTIP, then you're basically rewriting the rules of global trade to our advantage. Now we can't benefit from that. So it's more than just the tariffs.
Yeah.
Well, and along with that is that, again, that long-term outlook we've experienced in our own scenarios where we have a facility in India, and our customers are now asking us, well, can you make the product in India rather than the U.S. because India and China don't have the same tariffs. And so we've seen a lot more of the Chinese buyers going into India to source many of the same products that we manufacture and grow here in the U.S. So again, these create long-term where once supply chains are established, people don't want to go through the extra effort of having to readdress their supply chains. Once it's established, once you found a good manufacturer that you can trust and you can work with, again, it becomes something more than just a short 2-year time frame or such.
Thank you. And then the last sort of question that I would have for the panel, because we're coming to the end of our time, very quickly, this is a hard question and it may not be answerable, but thinking of each of your businesses, what can you do to make it tariff-proof, if anything? How tariffs will hit a certain amount of the raw materials that you use to manufacture your product, and your margins, I hope, are well above that. But is there anything you can do, continue to innovate, continue to have higher value products with higher margins that will allow you to fly above this to some extent?
It's a bit of a tautology because if we just say the solution is to creep higher and higher up the value chain with narrower and narrower products, that's certainly not going to make the trade deficit improve, because we're ceding more and more of the call it the medium value ground to competitors. I don't know that it's easy to describe how to tariff-proof. I think some of the reactions and the experiences are pretty fascinating. With our customers and in our own thinking and in discussing with other partners, everyone's building in an extra month. If you take this efficient Asian Atlantic shipping just-in-time zone, which we acknowledge as well, it's cheaper for Amy or for Ames or Brown and Haley to ship product to Shanghai than to ship product to Chicago, right? That's why you hear export, export, export from us. When everyone is uncertain and people are rushing to move product back and forth to beat certain expected potential tariff deadlines, No, there were no containers in Q4 of 2018. This is a hard cost when you're expecting product to arrive over in Asia or product to come back and there are no containers. Or when the vessel is full down in California and it bypasses Tacoma and Seattle and you can't make your delivery. So we're, I don't know that it's tariff proofing, but we're in response, we're actually having to add cost in to the business system, making us less competitive. And then that, causes you to look more at alternatives that, remove economic activity from this rather unique tariff zone.
Tariffs are taxes, and exporting countries don't pay them.
Just to add, I don't think it's possible, at least from my view, we can think our competitive advantage, why are they buying pre-impregnated carbon fiber from Tacoma, shipping it to Bangladesh, Thailand, China, in a reefer, making the golf club shaft or the hockey stick and shipping it back, okay? Labor and the competitive advantage, they can't make the same type of product in China, okay? But, so could we be, we have a competitive advantage. Eventually what happens though, is prices go up and you don't buy the new set of golf club shafts. Which means they don't make the shafts, they don't buy the pre-rig. Okay, that's eventually. On the aerospace side, we're pretty much, insulated. Once again, if there's big enough tariffs and China doesn't buy Boeing airplanes, they could have a huge impact to not only the Puget Sound region, but the United States.
Sure.
So I don't know if it's possible because it's a trickle down. Eventually, somebody's going to pay because it is a tax, or don't pay, and then the Yamada will not be able to buy new golf club shafts.
I do have some thoughts. I think innovation and brand equity, making sure that we are being innovative, because what you will find is, yes, the more innovation and the more gap you can create, then the less competition and the less more difficult, I should say, that it becomes to manufacture that same type of product. Brand, making sure that you have a strong brand and that your consumers or your customers resonate with your brand. We see that in the China market, that even though irrespective of the tariffs, they're still buying Coach purses. And so there is that inherent brand. The more that your brand stands for something and represents and connects with the consumer, that has a value to, I think, help with those tariffs.
Okay, good. So,
just to add something like what Amy was talking about, is just what we're seeing, talk about value add for establishing brand. The impact of the tariffs, we're now seeing data for the first time. And basically, if you're on the tariff list overall, your exports went down 25%, 26.5% compared to last year. To China, it was down 19%. But the HTS chapters that got hit the worst were the commodities. You have wood products, 58%. You have iron and steel, primary, 84%. Further manufactured iron and steel, up 18%, even though they're hit with tariffs. You have paper, down 19%. The only manufactured product sector that went down was shipping and vessel construction, 74% down. Other rest seem to weather the tariffs as of now pretty well, and that's based on the different factors. The tariff rates were imposed at different times. The tariff rates, vary from 5% up to 120% in some cases, additional retaliatory tariffs. And it's also the product involved, whether it's unique or has its own, cachet.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Robert. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for coming here and sharing your experience and your insight. And I'd like for us to acknowledge them with some applause. And now we have some microphones. I think we have a few minutes to perhaps take questions from the audience. Michael, would assume most people in the room know you, but in case they don't, could you let them know?
Michael Fowler, World Trade Center, Tacoma. I'm going to ask you an easy question, Robert, and then a hard one. The easy one is the exports, the bump in exports. How much was any of that due to people trying to buy before the retaliatory tariffs?
It could be these looked at the 2017 months compared to 2018, the date before the tariff went in place, so the following months. There could be some delay there, and possibly there would be contractual reasons or trying to get in ahead of time for tariffs. That's possible. We'll know more. So this is the first real look at the data. It's no by means the end of the story.
Okay, great. And the next one is a dangerous one. What's going to happen? Obviously, we have an election cycle starting. We have a president that cannot get reelected without a good economy. At the same time, you have people negotiating. You have difficult challenges with IP negotiations in particular. What's your gut feeling?
I think we're in for I think our relationship with China has changed. I think there's rumors about this document out there, maybe 150 pages with China. How fleshed out that is, I don't know. What it covers, don't know. It could be that gets signed in the next couple months, which could lead to maybe a goodwill gesture of scaling back the tariffs a little bit, but I don't see them being phased out. So you see, the proof is in the implementation, no matter what's in the paper. And the history of getting to agreements with China in the past has not been great in terms of implementation. Have things changed now? I'm not completely clear. There's factors pulling both ways on that one. But it could be that they announce some sort of agreement which might temporarily tone things down for a little bit, but you still have the threat for the $267 billion possibly out there if things don't go well, and who knows. Then you have the other tariffs. There's steel tariffs and aluminum tariffs, and I hear that the USMCA probably will not go forward unless we resolve those issues, at least with respect to Mexico and Canada, which will lead to some tariff relief on their part.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Alicia Gilson from Mid-America. I just have a question, either John or the Amy. So I understand that China is your #1 buying market. So have you, in the past so many years, experienced any, like the imitation of your products, or do you have any way of protecting your copyright or variety of your products? So yeah, that's all. Thank you.
As that we are aware of, as of yet, no, we have not had any experiences with copying or infringement. But I mean, depending on the item, again, the competition, the commodity type items like nuts tend to be copied in the sense of they're more competition with other brands. So that's really where the notion of making sure that you have strong brand value and differentiating yourself through brand can be important. But we have not had any direct knockoffs that we are aware of.
We have had what I would call a few little skirmishes in some different jurisdictions, in some different countries. This might be someone who feels like Roca is a really good name for a candy, and they're not making our candy, and they're not using pink, but they still think it's a good name. And we've always been successful in using the appropriate trademark registrations to deal with that. In China, in parts of China is a little bit of a free-for-all, and Amy said something which is really true that we're aware of. So we have encountered once what I would consider to be a fake, and we were able to address it, and the fake went away pretty quickly. Hearkening to your comment, Robert, about having an agreement versus the implementation of the agreement, we have a large Italian competitor called Ferrero, and they make Ferrero Rocher, which is perhaps the #2 confection in the world wrapped in gold foil. And they have had a lot of issues in China, and interestingly, they have had formal court, it's called the AIC, the Administrative Tribunal, formal court rulings in their favor that lead to no implementation. And it's been a long, difficult struggle. So, the notion of tightening IP, respect for IP through this trade negotiation, even when it comes to food products, is material.
Hello, my name is Chris Cummins. I'm also with Mid-America Overseas. So,
which is what?
Chris?
Mid-America Overseas.
Mid-America Overseas. Sorry, we're a full-service international freight forwarder based out of Renton, Washington. So I'm very familiar with the panelists. So my question is related to the tariffs, as everything is, but I guess what I wanted to say is one thing that I encounter as a freight forwarder down the scale is when I provide services to companies such as yours as a customs broker, I'm also outlaying duties and taxes at that time. And then you get net 30 days with me. So as before, I might have had a 0 to 3% outlay. Now I've got a 10 to 25% outlay. I don't increase any of my rates. So I've become a bank now that's providing 30 to 60 day terms, and nothing's really benefiting me from that. But with that as background, the tariffs are incredibly frustrating to me, and it seems like there's not a lot I can do. So my question is, do we know where all the tariff monies are currently applied? And depending on the answer to that, are there better ways that tariff monies can be applied, because in the assumption that they're not going anywhere soon?
I'm going to jump in on that one. When this first came up, I asked our federal delegation that we have a full-time federal liaison to Washington for the Port of Seattle on both aviation and maritime. And I asked the question, are we at least using these tariff revenues for export promotion or some sort of trade infrastructure, capacity building? And the answer is no. It goes into the general fund, and it's not allocated at all. And so we've actually worked with Adam Smith's office to see if, first thing we say is we do not agree with tariffs, but if you're going to hang these around our necks, at the very least, you can help us to lower the costs to the exporters and importers of working with the trade infrastructure in the United States. Unfortunately, we're getting the door's not open with the administration right now. So we're going to keep working on that. You asked what can you do, and as a politician, I'd say vote. It's very important.
Time for one more.
One more. Yes. My name is Luis Morris. I buy and export products. I'm not a manufacturer per se, but I understand, I hear what you're saying here. It's going on everywhere. I buy equipment from manufacturers in Chicago, California, some of your company products, sub-products, and all of them are in the same boat. But my question here today is,
I go and look for the client abroad, and I sell to Mexico and South America. And I've always used a very good document name or called MOU. What is the story about the MOUs? Are MOUs going to continue to be used or are not? When you're selling and you produce a contract right off the first conversation, it's so hard to convince a buyer to sign it. MOUs seem to be a much better way. We have an MOU, initial agreement, we firm it up as we go on. What's going to happen? Anybody can answer me that question with the MOUs. Are we going to sign contracts or sign MOUs or what do we call it? No more MOUs?
I don't know what they're going to. Are you talking about with China or with
the world? With the world.
I don't know what the future of MOUs. I hear that term used in different ways.
There's formal treaties and then there's MOUs, right?
Yeah. Well, the president knows.
He had a discussion with the White House over that.
Not to call MOUs, and I called my lawyer and said, well, what do we do? Do you know?
Michael, really quickly.
Really quick. My understanding is that they're simply going to use a different word in negotiations, right? I think he said we won't use that word anymore. I think that the objection was that the president said, I don't like MOUs. And so Lighthizer response was, okay, fine, we don't use the word MOU, they're going to use another word.
Just like NAFTA, I guess. We don't call it NAFTA anymore. It's going to be
well, you get the issues of, well, does it have to be considered by Congress? And Lighthouse is saying, whatever it is, we don't know what we're going to call it, but we're not going to put it by Congress. And then you get into WTO issues as well.
So this water seems to be getting very deep very quickly. This is a complex issue, so I want to end this here. But I'd like to invite our commissioners up, our port commissioners up to make some concluding remarks.
Perhaps I could just make just a few side comments first, if I could. For Robert and Andrew, I will tell you, I had a conversation with the Chief Executive Officer, Robert Haley, who told me your boss, the governor, when you get him out selling products in Asia, that he does an outstanding job. So if he's not real busy in the foreseeable future, get him out doing that. I'm really impressed with the business leaders I'm here today. I know a couple of them are local, and Dennis is a Melin grad, went to UPS, started with Tori as an accountant. As Dennis and I discussed when I was on the commission before I became a judge, I was involved in Tori coming to our location now. So glad to see that local talent stay here to lead the organization. Same with you, Amy. I think if I read your bio correctly, you may have gone to Andy Wright, UPS as well, and University of Washington. Really like seeing that local business talent stay here. For the Consul General, I heard that you like to play golf. I can tell you that Pearson Clare is a former classmate and close friend of the architect for Chambers Bay, Robert Trent Jones. So if you want some advice on the architect of that facility, please talk to this gentleman here. It seems to me that Washington businesses have invested lots of time and money to build relationships with customers in these markets. And protectionist policies, retaliatory tariffs can create uncertainty in the marketplace, increase prices, and drive buyers to look for alternatives to Washington products. So we all want a proactive and productive trade policy, fair and level playing field for our exporters. We want to make sure existing trade rules are enforced, and because ultimately we all see the regional benefit of selling more goods to more people throughout the world. So thank you for participating and being here today.
Thank you.
I'll just say, Commissioner McCarthy is talking about everybody else's amazing background and credentials. He represents an incredible family of public servants. His wife is the state auditor, his son serves on the Tacoma City Council. Who knows what your grandkids are going to do? And he, of course, has had decades of public service, so he's a pretty incredible peer and mentor for me. I'm maybe take it up to kind of 30,000 foot level and talk about a concept for me that I think is really important in all of this, which is this notion of soft power. We in the United States have enjoyed an incredible amount of soft power over the last century, really, in our ascendance to be one of two superpowers. And I think we take that for granted. And it's really driven by our economic might. We like to think that it's our amazing political system or our cultural influence, but I think it's really driven by journalists like this, the folks who get out there with their brands, with their ability to exchange on the international sphere. And when we take our ball and go home, when we do, as John said, decide that we're no longer going to be a part of the rules-making process, we give up that soft power and we shrink our sphere of influence. And while today we talked a lot about what that means for job creation right here at home, for me, another very important consideration is what does that mean for our ability to spread a message of democracy? When my parents, baby boomers, were growing up, they lived in a world in which the notions of democracy and capitalism were wedded entirely. If you had one, you had the other. And the notions of a command and control economy was associated almost entirely with authoritarianism. But millennials don't have that same perception. I'm a Gen Xer, I'm a little confused. But millennials see that quite possibly the most robust form of capitalism right now is under an authoritarian state. And one of the most uncertain forms of capitalism is in a democratic state. And I'm concerned that because of some of these endemic changes, we're losing our ability to spread a soft power message that for me is really important around democracy and human rights and the expansion of liberty. And so I don't want us to give up that soft power because of a trade dispute. And I would hope that as we continue these conversations that we push forward not just for economic benefit, but also for the social and cultural benefit. So thank you all for coming and thank you for facilitating.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of our commissioners, Commissioner McCarthy, Commissioner Calkins. I'd like to bring up Karen to take us out and into the informal part of the afternoon.
Great, definitely. Oh, well, thank you all so much for being here. Definitely the discussion here today, I mean, as we crafted and created this program and event, you know, we know Washington State, 40% of our jobs are directly tied to international trade. We know that China and Japan are our top trading partners. And really the idea was to have all sort of facets of that conversation to be able to have it here today. So I just really want to thank Commissioners McCarthy and Calkins, Consul General Yamada, Andrew for your lovely facilitation, and our panelists of Robert, Amy, John, and Dennis. Certainly today has exceeded my expectations and hopes in terms of a lively and informative discussion. And so many of you here in the room add to that as well. And so certainly I hope that we'll be able to enjoy and continue discussions over some refreshments. I really want to thank all the organizing partners of World Trade Center Tacoma, Washington State China Relations Council, and Japan-America Society. And so with that, we are adjourned for some refreshments, and I would love all of our speakers to gather for a group photo before we launch into that. So thank you all so much for coming.
It was great. Thank you very much.
sort of decide how you would